The time that GraphQL first clicked for me was when we had a project where the front-end people were requesting a lot of changes in the API, and it was request a change, wait a few days or a week until it could be prioritized and they had time to do it. And with GraphQL, it allowed us to not have to make that be a back and forth process. With GraphQL, you can have an API that's kind of generic, that provides all the possible fields that you might want to ask for, and the client can choose in which circumstance it asks for which different fields. So with REST APIs, you often end up having for performance reasons, you end up having duplicated APIs that are similar, but they have different sets of fields in each one, or slightly different results, but overall are quite similar. And this is duplicated work for the back-end team, and it's a code maintenance problem over time. And it's also a problem of workflow. When the front-end people need the changed API to be available, it's not there right away. They need to wait for it to be built. The common pain point with our clients that are implementing GraphQL, it's usually now about developer productivity, actually. And it's often about the productivity of a front-end team. And the problem that it solves is not needing to ask for changes in the API and having the API be ready and available right away when they need it. And even if it's not ready and available already, because they have a schema to work with, they can start building out the client side against mock data and a fake version of the API while the backend team has perhaps not even started. I think the reason why GraphQL is really a joy to work with, it has a lot to do with the tooling and the automatically generated documentation, and in some ways there's part of it is an aesthetic thing, which sounds frivolous, but in fact it's not. I think aesthetics are actually quite important, and there's something that feels good about it. Part of it is that you can just guarantee that those nice things, even though an equivalent might be available for REST, there are API specification tools for REST, and there are great client tools for REST, but with GraphQL, you know that those are available. They're guaranteed to be there. It's guaranteed that you have documentation automatically generated for you, and you don't have to rely on the team being better than average for those to exist. I think a really important reason why companies should be looking at GraphQL now when they're building something new, or even if they're looking to refactor and improve something existing, is about developer productivity. And I think originally, when a lot of people first hear about GraphQL, what they hear about is something sort of low level. It's about less bytes over the wire, less network round trips. But I think that's not really the most important reason why there's a lasting and major benefit. I think the real benefit is about productivity. Developers on the front end can typically move faster. They don't have to wait for back-end changes to be built out before they start working on the client-side feature. And in fact, they can find out things that they want to improve with the API before the API has even been built, which is actually saving time for the back-end team as well, because they don't have to rebuild something. I think the best way to get started, if possible, is on something small. You don't have to do a big bang and rewrite the whole thing. In fact, I wouldn't recommend that at all. Start with something small. It can be one page, one component, one route. We are currently helping a client rebuild an app that we're actually doing it route by route. So this is a legacy app that was built with Backbone, and we're bringing it into 2019, converting it to React and GraphQL in place, one route at a time. I think the front end developers are really the people that are driving GraphQL adoption the most, because they see the most immediate benefit. It lets them not have to wait for the back-end teams to respond to changes and to build things out before they can start using them. But there are a lot of hidden benefits for the back-end team as well. They're less obvious, but less rework on things, less duplicated, similar API endpoints. I think the concrete developer experience benefits that you get with GraphQL are things like automatically generated documentation, being able to trust that the API returns what it's supposed to do. So you'll never end up with an integer field returning null or NA or something weird that you have to handle in your UI. So it's less code to write, less unexpected errors that happen only in production. You've got documentation automatically generated. So while there are tools for REST that can do a lot of these things, you can't rely on them always being there. And generally teams are pretty above average if they are actually using all those tools in REST. And with GraphQL, it's guaranteed. We're helping a client right now move a legacy app with a very complicated UI. We're helping them move to GraphQL. And the biggest benefit that they're seeing is simplified state management on the client side. We're using the Apollo client framework, and it takes care of a lot of state management that would otherwise be quite complex with Redux or other sort of roll your own state management type things. So it takes a lot of the work that client-side developers have to do, a lot of the complexity, which is often quite error-prone. It takes all of that, rolls it up in a framework that makes it quite easy to use. Right now, GraphQL is seeing a lot of adoption at the early stages with surprisingly large companies. They have started using it very quickly. A lot of them are still at the early stages with it, and I think most of them will continue to use it. I think it's definitely going to grow and probably will take over most use cases eventually. I don't see REST going away. There are so many legacy services in most big companies right now that are using REST that they're never going to go away. A lot of people are putting a GraphQL-based API gateway in front of REST services. This is a pattern that you might feel that it's adding complexity, and there's definitely sort of like when you do this archaeology of the history of all the systems inside a big company, definitely it's adding more to it, but it really actually simplifies their day-to-day life. A best practice that's often recommended for GraphQL is to have one graph for the company as much as possible, and it helps to unify a lot of different back-end systems with a well thought out API, with a set of entities and fields that make sense for the whole company. And this is an opportunity for people to really rethink what goes into that layer and what that API looks like, so that when you have a new team that comes along, a new product that needs to consume some of the same data, they're not using a new set of bespoke back-end REST APIs that are similar but not quite the same. They can reuse what already exists. Yeah, well, the classical reason to use GraphQL is actually for performance. The reason why it was originally created is to have one network round trip with the client being able to explicitly specify what fields they use and not overfetch things. That is a huge benefit. You can get the same benefit with a REST API, but it comes at the cost of complexity. So you can build one REST API that's perfectly tailored to the exact fields, that has only one network round trip for your whole page, but it will be a duplicate of some other almost similar API. Another benefit of GraphQL that we found is that when it comes to doing something with real-time data or near real-time data, where you want server push data, the benefit is that you end up with the same programming model that you're used to using for everything else. With REST-based applications, as soon as you want to add something that's real-time, you end up either having to add a whole new type of infrastructure, or else you just resort to polling to keep it simple. Because something server pushed is very different from what you can do with REST. And with GraphQL, you have subscriptions that are quite similar to the way everything else in GraphQL works. So subscriptions are essentially the result of someone else's mutations. If you're a developer and you want to introduce GraphQL into your organization, I would say the best way to do it is start really small and have a purpose that that other people can buy into. Solve a real problem and don't be blindly evangelizing something. Have a real reason and understand what the costs and the trade-offs might be.